Welcome to Quantum Voyager Stories, where science fiction touches the soul and every story takes you somewhere you've never been, leaving something real behind. Life in the cabin began to change. Not with a bang, but with small, deliberate moments that built themselves into something steady. There was no grand announcement, no decision made aloud. But after the storm of old memories and unspeakable grief, something quieter had started to take root. Rhythm. Kaelen noticed it first in the mornings. Where once the silence of dawn had belonged only to the wind and the scrape of his boots, it was now gently broken by the rustling of fabric, the clatter of dishes being carefully placed back into a wooden rack, and the soft murmur of Selyra humming under her breath. He'd wake to find Coren already at work on the roof, patches of thermal sheeting draped across his shoulder, face flushed from the cold but focused. The boy didn't wait for instructions anymore. He moved with purpose, matching Kaelen's pace with a quiet sort of pride that didn't need praise. Nira, small and determined, had claimed a new job for herself, firekeeper. She took it very seriously. Each morning she'd toddle toward the hearth with arms full of kindling too large for her frame, cheeks pink from effort, lips curled in concentration. Kaelen would stoop to help, not out of necessity, but out of ritual. Their hands would touch briefly over the dry wood, and she would beam at him like she'd just won a medal. He never told her it was unnecessary. That kind of purpose mattered. Selyra, too, seemed to shift in how she moved through the space. She no longer walked as if prepared to leave at a moment's notice. Her coat hung by the door now, not draped over her chair. She folded blankets and placed them in neat stacks, rearranged shelves that had long been cluttered with Kaelen's neglect. He didn't stop her. He didn't want to. There was a moment, subtle but clear, when he realized their lives had begun to tangle. He was washing out an old kettle, scraping off the rust from the lip, when Selyra wordlessly passed him a clean rag. Their eyes met. No one looked away. Later that same day, Coren held a set of nails in place while Kaelen hammered a support beam into the back wall. The boy didn't flinch under the weight of the swing. He just looked up and asked, "Is this how you did it in the field?" Kaelen paused. "Yeah," he said. "It is." And Coren nodded, like that answer had filled something more important than a question. Meals were still simple. The rations were meager, the food stretched thin. But they ate together now. Not in silence, not in separation. Nira told stories about the snow creatures she swore she'd seen in her dreams. Coren offered dry corrections with the seriousness of a scholar. Selyra smiled, occasionally throwing a glance Kaelen's way, as if checking to see if he found it amusing too. He did. Sometimes Kaelen found himself just watching, not in the way a soldier watches for threats, but in the way a man watches something fragile bloom, uncertain if it will last, but unwilling to look away. The cabin hadn't changed much. The walls were still old. The cold still crept in when the fire burned low. But within those imperfect bones, something unspoken had begun to grow. They hadn't called it family. They hadn't called it anything. But it moved like a heartbeat. And for the first time in years, Kaelen moved with it. It wasn't the big gestures that changed the way the cabin felt. It was the small things, the unnoticed things, the things that didn't need to be said aloud. Kaelen came in one afternoon after splitting wood to find a scarf folded neatly on the bench by the door. It was woolen, old, patched in places but clean, and he knew instantly it wasn't his. The weave was too fine, the care too intentional. Selyra didn't mention it. She just gave him a nod when he slipped it on the next morning. Another day, he caught himself reaching for 2 mugs instead of 1 when heating water. Then 3, then 4. Without thinking, without asking, Selyra began reorganizing the cabinets. Not the way someone preparing to leave would, but like someone who planned to remember where the sugar was next week. She moved Kaelen's tools from the table to a side drawer and replaced them with a wooden bowl of dried roots and crushed herbs. He didn't protest. In fact, it made sense. Coren began keeping inventory of supplies. He had a system now, chalk markings on the inner side of the door, tallying food rations, firewood, and water levels. Kaelen let him. It wasn't just useful. It gave the boy a sense of ownership. And Nira, ever observant, started bringing small bits of color into the home. She drew pictures on bark, people, animals, stars, and stuck them on the walls with resin from the sapwood Kaelen had once discarded as useless. One day, she left a sketch on his workbench. 4 figures, hand in hand, standing in front of the cabin. Above it, she'd scribbled, "Here is warm." Kaelen stared at it longer than he meant to. He didn't say anything, but the drawing remained, pinned there by a piece of metal from an old comm dish. That night, Selyra quietly placed a folded cloth across the end of his cot. It was stitched with the initials KV. Not hers, not Coren's or Nira's. His. He looked at her questioningly. "It was in the bottom of your old chest," she said. "Felt wrong not to give it back." He ran a finger across the fabric. "I'd forgotten it was even there." "I hadn't," she replied. Later, he found himself fixing a creaky cabinet door not because it was urgent, but because Selyra's fingers had caught on it the night before. He added a second hook to the entrance so Nira could hang her coat without dragging it on the floor. He sanded a piece of spare wood smooth and handed it to Coren to use as a writing surface. No one called attention to these things, but they kept happening. The cabin began to feel different. Not warmer, not softer, but settled. As if it finally knew what it was. Not just a shelter, not just a hiding place, but a living thing, filled with the weight of quiet care. There were no declarations, no ceremonies. But when Kaelen walked in from the cold one evening and saw Selyra stirring a pot at the hearth, Coren scribbling notes by the window, and Nira curled up beside the fire with her blanket and drawings, he paused at the door. Not because he was unsure of his place inside, but because, for the first time in years, he knew it. Before they arrived, the cabin had known only the silence of survival, the kind of quiet that echoed in hollow spaces and settled in the bones like frost. But now there were footsteps, laughter, questions that demanded answers, even if they didn't make sense. There was life again. Nira was the first to break through, with her curiosity, her fearless chatter, and her uncanny ability to find wonder in even the smallest things. She moved through the cabin like sunlight slipping between shutters. She made games out of chores, assigned names to the pots and pans, and insisted the cabin itself had a favorite blanket, the soft blue one, she claimed, because it smells like warm days. Kaelen didn't know how to respond to her at first. He wasn't used to constant attention, to questions that came in bursts like little sparks. "Why is the sky pink sometimes? Do you think stars can fall asleep? If you smile at a shadow, does it smile back?" He answered awkwardly at first, short, factual responses. But she never seemed disappointed. She'd just nod, satisfied, and continue her exploration of both the world and the quiet man she'd chosen to follow. Coren, older and more reserved, took longer. He still watched Kaelen with cautious eyes, weighed his words before speaking, and often stayed close to Selyra when things felt uncertain. But little by little, his demeanor softened. One afternoon, Kaelen caught him outside, crouched in the snow beside a broken relay dish. The boy was using scraps of wire and a metal plate to fashion what looked like a makeshift weather vane. Kaelen approached quietly. Trying to catch the wind? Coren didn't look up. Trying to learn it. That answer stayed with him. From that day on, Kaelen began leaving small tools where Coren could find them. A spare multi-tool near the storage shelf. A soldering wand wrapped in cloth, left by the fire. Coren never said thank you, but he used them, and he returned them clean, well-kept, and sometimes even slightly improved. In the evenings, when the wind howled outside and the cold threatened to press in through every crevice, the two children would fill the space with movement. Nira would dance with her blanket trailing behind her like a cape. Coren would quietly read aloud from an old datapad they'd salvaged from the storeroom. His voice flat but steady, while Nira acted out the parts with dramatic flair. Kaelen would sit in the corner, watching, a mug of heated root tea in hand. And without meaning to, he'd find himself smiling. Not the kind of smile worn for others, but the kind that came slowly from deep inside. The kind that hurt a little because it had been buried so long. Sometimes he'd catch Selyra watching him during these moments. She never said a word, but her eyes said enough. It wasn't just the cabin that had changed. It was him. He wasn't ready to call it family. Not yet. The word still felt too fragile, too holy. But he couldn't deny what was happening. The children weren't just guests anymore. They were his stormbreakers, the ones who had stepped into the silence and filled it with life. Kaelen didn't know exactly when it started, that shift between them. It wasn't a sudden spark or some dramatic realization. It was more like gravity. Subtle, constant, and impossible to ignore once you felt it pulling. There was a rhythm to the way he and Selyra began moving through the space. Unspoken cues. A glance, a nod, a shared weight of silence that no longer felt heavy. They often worked side by side now. One afternoon, the western door had frozen slightly off its hinge from the frost creeping into the frame. Kaelen started repairs before first light. Selyra joined him shortly after, pulling on thick gloves and kneeling beside him without a word. For the better part of an hour, they worked in quiet harmony. He hammering, she holding the frame steady, their breaths visible in the cold air. At one point, their hands brushed, callous skin against callous skin, and neither pulled away. When they finished, the door swung smoothly. Selyra tested it once, twice, then turned to him with the faintest smile. "Feels like it's ours now," she said softly. Kaelen didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said he understood. Another evening, during a short power outage, the cabin dimmed into soft shadow. The fire still burned, but the small overhead lights flickered out, leaving the room lit only by flame and starlight filtering through frosted windows. The children had already curled up beneath their blankets. Coren snored softly, and Nira lay curled against his side. One hand clutched around a wooden spoon she refused to part with, even in sleep. Kaelen sat on the floor near the hearth, legs stretched out, shoulders heavy with the long day. Selyra lowered herself down beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched. She held out a small piece of bread, flat, slightly burned, but still warm. "It's not much," she said. "It's enough," Kaelen replied, taking it from her without hesitation. They sat there, sharing silence and crumbs, the fire painting gold across their faces. "I used to think I'd never feel safe indoors again," Selyra admitted, staring into the flames. "Too many places turned on me. Too many walls that weren't mine." Kaelen nodded. "Same." She looked at him then, and for the first time he held her gaze. Not with guarded distance, but with something softer, something open. "You're different than I expected," she said. "So are you." Her lips curled, half smile, half something else. "We're all different now." And maybe that was the truth neither had dared say aloud. They weren't who they had been. They never would be again. War had taken pieces of them. Time had dulled the edges. Grief had taught them how to live with holes. But here, in this moment, they weren't broken. They were just human. When Selyra's shoulder finally rested against his, he didn't move away. He didn't even flinch. He let it happen. And for the first time in a very long time, Kaelen didn't feel alone in the quiet. He felt seen. The cabin hadn't changed much from the outside. It was still the same weather-worn structure crouched against the frozen landscape of Altherra. Snow still gathered at the eaves, and the wind still sang through the trees like a memory that wouldn't let go. But inside, everything was different. There were traces now, signs that the space no longer belonged to just one man and his ghosts. On the far wall, just above the tools, hung a crooked line of Nira's drawings. Stars with too many points, animals with wings too large, and stick figures labeled with initials no one had taught her to write. Kaelen had left them there, not out of sentimentality, but because when he tried to take one down to make room for a supply rack, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Near the window, Coren had fashioned a small shelf out of scrap wood. It held a few salvaged books, a repaired light pad, and a small model of a starship he'd carved from a branch during one of the longer storms. He didn't say it was his space, but he sat there most evenings, reading with a seriousness Kaelen had come to admire. Selyra had claimed the kitchen, not with words but with motion. The utensils were no longer scattered or rusted. They were cleaned, organized, even oiled. She'd managed to hang a string of tiny solar lights over the counter, their glow flickering like low-hanging stars. Kaelen had carved an extra chair. Not because anyone asked him to, not because they didn't have enough, but because Nira always sat cross-legged on the floor during meals, and he wanted her to have something her size. He didn't say that when he placed it near the table, just pushed it in with a quiet nod. She'd hugged the chair before sitting in it. There were other changes, too subtler ones. Boots lined up by the door, not kicked aside. Blankets folded over the backs of chairs. A dried flower someone had pressed between two planks on the windowsill. And laughter. Real, unforced laughter that came from children playing or from Selyra rolling her eyes when Kaelen burned the stew. It filled corners that had long been left empty. He realized it one evening as he stood at the doorway, watching the light inside dance across their faces. The cold clung to his coat, but he didn't feel it. This place, once a fortress of solitude, had become something else. Not perfect, not planned, but theirs. It wasn't the walls that made it home. It wasn't the furniture or the fire or the roof overhead. It was the marks they left on it, and the way it now held them in return. Kaelen stepped inside and shut the door behind him, not to keep the world out, but to seal this moment in. Mornings used to be something Kaelen endured. They came cold and gray, indifferent to whether he rose or not. For years, he dragged himself from sleep out of sheer necessity, because the fire had to be fed, the filters checked, the roof patched. There had been no joy in it, just rhythm, just survival. But now he woke before the light hit the horizon. Not from restlessness, but from purpose. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift. He realized it one morning as he sat on the edge of his cot, listening. Not for danger, not for silence, but for sound. The faint hum of Selyra stirring in the other room. The muffled rustle of Nira kicking off her blanket. The creak of the old floorboard Coren always stepped on, no matter how carefully he moved. These sounds meant something now. Kaelen no longer moved through his routines like a ghost. He stretched. He washed his hands before breakfast. He even shaved sometimes, unevenly, but it made Nira giggle, and he found he liked that sound more than silence. He started the fire not just for heat, but for the comfort it brought them all. He began to notice which logs burned slower, which ones popped loudly and scared the children. He chose quieter wood now. Breakfast became more than a ration task. He experimented, adding crushed herbs to the broth, slicing root vegetables thinner so they'd cook faster. He let Nira stir the pot while he watched, offering only the gentlest of corrections. Selyra would smile at him over the rim of her cup, and he found himself holding that gaze a little longer each time. He began teaching Coren how to repair the secondary water unit, not just to take over the task, but because the boy showed genuine interest. Kaelen talked him through each part of the filtration system, pointing out weak welds, suggesting better sealants, showing him how to reprogram the flow sensor. Coren listened, really listened, and when Kaelen handed him the tools the next day, he used them like they belonged in his hands. Kaelen had once imagined himself dying alone on this planet, forgotten, unmissed. Now he caught himself wondering whether he had enough supplies to reinforce the east wall before the spring thaw. He calculated how many seeds they had left and whether the soil patches could support more than mossroot this year. He looked at Altherra not as a prison, but as a place with potential. Even the sky looked different. He used to stare at it like a man watching the edge of a world he didn't belong to, a dome of stars that mocked his isolation. Now he looked up and thought of what might grow here, of what could last. Kaelen didn't say these things aloud. He wasn't ready for that. But in the way he walked, in the way he reached for his coat in the morning, in the way his hand lingered on the doorframe before stepping outside, it was clear. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. It started with a scrape. Nira had been chasing a dust moth through the snow outside the cabin. Bundled in a coat too large and boots she refused to tie properly. She tripped, nothing serious, just a tumble over a frozen root. Kaelen had been close enough to catch the moment, close enough to kneel beside her and brush the snow from her gloves. He expected the tears. Nira was tough, but she was still a child. Instead, she looked up at him, a little startled, but not crying. She held up her palm. A shallow cut ran across her skin, no deeper than a paper slice. But it glowed, just for a second. A soft, almost imperceptible shimmer, like moonlight reflected in still water, rippled over the wound. Then it closed. Seamless. No blood. No scab. Just skin. Kaelen froze. Nira didn't seem to notice. She bounced to her feet, brushed off her knees, and ran back toward the cabin, her laughter trailing behind her. But Kaelen remained crouched for a long moment, his mind turning over what he had just seen. He wasn't hallucinating. He'd seen battle wounds, surgical incisions, plasma burns. He knew the rate at which tissue healed, and that wasn't it. That was something else. He didn't mention it that night. Not to Selyra. Not even to himself. Not out loud. But from then on, he started watching more closely. There were other things, small, easily missed. Coren could hold his breath longer than any child Kaelen had ever met. He scaled the perimeter ridge in a quarter of the time it took most trained scouts. When they were checking the cabin's energy cells, Kaelen noticed the biometric reader struggled to calibrate to Coren's touch. Pulsed twice, flickered red, then reset. Coren shrugged it off like it happened all the time. Kaelen didn't press. But the pieces began to fit together in uncomfortable ways. One afternoon, while checking the comm tower for damage, he found Selyra already up the ladder, tools in hand. He started to call out. She hated heights but then stopped. She moved with a grace that didn't match the bulk of her coat. Her balance was perfect, her footing exact. She reached the top, adjusted the node, and climbed down faster than he would have trusted himself to. Later, when he asked how she'd learned to calibrate antennae, she simply said, "I watched you do it." Kaelen didn't respond, but her answer stayed with him. These weren't just quirks. They weren't coincidences. They were patterns. He caught her looking at him once, not in fear, not in guilt, but with a kind of quiet knowing. Like she had seen the questions building in him and was waiting for the moment he'd finally ask them aloud. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. What struck him most wasn't the abilities, the healing, the reflexes, the moments of impossible precision. It was how normal she tried to be, how human she insisted on acting, and how carefully the children mirrored that effort. They laughed like human children, argued like siblings, ate with their hands, wiped their mouths on their sleeves. But when they were alone, when they didn't think he was watching, Kaelen noticed something else. Coren touched surfaces with the backs of his fingers, as if sensing something beneath the texture. Nira hummed in strange, melodic patterns when she played. Selyra sometimes stared too long at the stars, her eyes catching the light just a little too brightly. Kaelen didn't know what they were, but he knew they weren't just refugees. And somehow that didn't scare him. It intrigued him. He wasn't sure what that said about him, about who he was becoming, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he listened more closely, watched more gently, and waited. It was the quietest night in weeks. No wind, no creaking branches, just the low, steady pulse of the fire and the soft sound of Nira breathing, curled up beneath her blanket like a sleeping ember. Coren was still outside, gathering the last of the snowcatch for drinking water. The stars hung low over Altherra, closer than they had any right to be, giant, glimmering things that made the sky feel full. Kaelen was cleaning out the filter pump by the fire when he felt Selyra watching him. Not like she usually did, guarded, observant, weighing the moment. No, this was different. Her gaze wasn't analytical tonight. It was waiting. When he finally looked up, she didn't turn away. "I know you've noticed," she said quietly. Kaelen didn't ask what she meant. There was no point pretending. The shimmer in Nira's skin, the way Coren moved, the starlight that sometimes flickered in her own eyes like a glitch in the world's rendering. Of course he'd noticed. He just hadn't asked. "You could have said something sooner," he replied, voice calm. Not accusing. Just tired of dancing around the truth. "I could have," she agreed, settling onto the floor across from him. "But I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. Or if I was ready to say it." She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Her posture was defensive, but her voice was steady. I'm not entirely human, Kaelen. Neither are they. He nodded slowly. I figured. Selyra let out a breath. Not of relief exactly, but release. The kind that comes when a weight is no longer yours alone to carry. My mother was human. My father wasn't, she continued. He was from a species called the Ilari. You've probably never heard of them. Most haven't. They were quiet, private, not built for war, not built for conquest. They lived in harmony with their environment, bioluminescent physiology, regenerative cells, heightened empathy, and a kind of sensory communication I can't even fully explain. Kaelen leaned back slightly, letting the information settle without interruption. The Ilari were wiped out during the first colonial expansions in the Varelian sector, she said. No one admitted it was genocide, of course. They called it territorial reclamation. But it was slaughter. My father barely escaped. He ended up on a fringe station where he met my mother. She was working as a technician. They fell in love, hid for a while. Then I was born. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't even know the truth until I was 12. My abilities had started showing, small things at first. I could sense people's emotions, heal from injuries faster than normal. When my mother told me, she made me promise to never tell anyone. Kaelen studied her. You kept that promise? I did, mostly, until the war. Her eyes dropped to the fire. The flames painted her skin in warm golds and oranges, but Kaelen could see it now, more clearly than ever. The shimmer just beneath the surface. The way her pupils reflected the light like liquid crystal. Not overt, not monstrous, just different. I tried to pass, she continued, tried to hide the signs. But after Taryn died, and I was left alone with Coren and pregnant with Nira, I stopped being able to keep it contained. She glanced toward the room where Nira slept. They were born with more of it than me. Their blood is stronger, their traits harder to mask. The community I returned to, they didn't know exactly what I was, but they knew I was wrong. And when Nira healed from a fall in front of the medic without even flinching, they didn't need proof. Just suspicion. Kaelen didn't interrupt. He let her speak. Every word came with years behind it, years of hiding, surviving, fearing. I didn't run just because of the judgment, she said. I ran because people started asking questions I couldn't answer without risking my children. Some wanted to study us. Some wanted to cleanse the gene line. One even offered to take Nira off my hands. Raise her in a proper home, he said, away from my contamination. Her hands clenched tightly, knuckles whitening. I've lived every day since then waiting for the knock at the door, for the ship on the horizon, for the scan that picks up the wrong frequency in our blood. Kaelen looked at her. Not as a soldier, not as a skeptic, but as a man who had spent most of his life running from his own ghosts. And me? He asked. Have you been waiting for me to turn on you? She shook her head. I've been waiting for you to stop looking at me like I'm just broken, like I'm fragile, like I'm something that needs hiding. Kaelen was quiet for a long time. Then finally he spoke. I don't think you're broken, Selyra. She looked up. I think you've survived something most people couldn't even understand. And you've raised 2 incredible kids through it. He shifted slightly, leaning forward. And if you are something more than human, I'm not sure that makes you less. Her breath caught just for a second. I don't need to understand everything to know this, he said. You're not the one I'm afraid of. Selyra studied him. The air between them was still, but full. Then slowly she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Kaelen didn't reply. He just reached forward and added another log to the fire. Because sometimes warmth didn't come from explanations. Came from staying. The next morning came with the soft hush of snow and a sky bruised with violet and pale gold. Kaelen stood outside the cabin, one hand resting on the wooden railing, the other clutching a mug still warm from the stove. His breath hung in the cold air, slow and measured. He wasn't thinking about protocols, or DNA, or whatever threat Selyra's bloodline might pose in the eyes of the world beyond Altherra. He was thinking about how steady her voice had been, How much it must have cost her to say the things she said. And how damn easy it would have been for him to retreat. Wrap himself back in silence, pretend nothing had changed. But it had. And for once in his life, Kaelen didn't run from what he couldn't explain. When he walked back inside, the fire was already going. Selyra sat at the table with Nira curled in her lap, whispering some story about moons that whispered back when spoken to. Coren stood in the corner, checking the water levels, his brow furrowed in focus. It looked ordinary, but Kaelen knew it wasn't, and that was the point. He hung up his coat, then crossed the room, slow and deliberate. Name. There was no ceremony, no sudden spark. It came in the little things woven so tightly into the rhythm of their days that, by the time he noticed it, it was already true. He showed Coren how to hold a blade steady, how to feel the edge of a whetstone and let patience guide the motion. Not for battle. For utility. The boy asked questions that were sharp and thoughtful, and Kaelen answered them with the calm weight of someone who once relied on precision for survival and now passed it down with care, not urgency. They sat together under the open sky on clear nights, the stars wheeling overhead in cold brilliance. Kaelen would trace patterns in the darkness, naming clusters and planets like old friends. Coren, always eager, always curious, began drawing his own maps, scribbled lines looping across wrinkled parchment. He insisted one day they'd name a star after Nira because she always looks up even when it's cloudy. And Kaelen listened. He listened when the wind shifted, teaching Coren how to read the quiet signs of approaching weather. How to track animals by more than footprints. How to sit still long enough to be part of the land, not just walking across it. He never called himself anything. But when Nira fell asleep one night at the table, her head buried in a drawing of fantastical treehouses and flying fish, Kaelen didn't hesitate. He gently lifted the worn coat from the back of her chair and began to mend the tear near the sleeve. His fingers worked slowly, methodically. The thread was too bright, the patch a little crooked, but he didn't care. It would hold. And she would be warm. He didn't wake her. He didn't explain what he'd done. He just folded the coat and set it beside her, close enough for her to find when morning came. No one said a word the next day. But Nira smiled at him a little longer than usual. And later, when she wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her cheek into his side without asking or warning, he only placed his hand gently on her back and let her stay. There were no spoken acknowledgments. No roles assigned. But in the small gestures, patient instruction, quiet repairs, silent reassurance, something unspoken had taken root. He was no longer just the man who opened the door in a storm. He was the one they looked to, not out of fear, but trust. Kaelen didn't need anyone to call him father. The word had always been too heavy, too sharp-edged, haunted by memories of what he'd lost. But in their eyes, in the way Coren leaned in when he spoke, in the way Nira's fingers curled around his own without hesitation, he saw it. They didn't need a word. They just needed him. And for the first time in a very long time, Kaelen let himself be needed. There was never a promise between them. No whispered vows in the night, no declarations spoken beside the fire. Theirs was not a bond built on assurances of a future they couldn't control. Not on this planet, not in this life. What Kaelen and Selyra shared was quieter than that. Stronger, in some ways, because it didn't depend on words. It lived in the spaces between. On cold mornings, they would often wake at the same time, not by design but by rhythm. Selyra would be stirring tea from dried leaves in a battered tin, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, eyes still soft from sleep. Kaelen would be by the stove, checking the embers, not saying much. And that silence, comfortable, unstrained, said more than any greeting ever could. They moved through the cabin like two halves of a well-practiced dance. She folded laundry while he patched the roof. He sharpened tools while she read aloud softly to Nira, her voice a lilt in the background. They never had to ask what the other was thinking. They simply knew. And when one of them lingered by the doorway just a little longer or sat down just a little closer, the other made space without question. There were nights when Kaelen would find her on the front step wrapped in a blanket, staring out across the frozen fields lit by moonlight. He'd sit beside her without speaking. Sometimes their shoulders would brush, sometimes not. They would sit there like that for long stretches, two figures carved from shadow and breath until the cold began to creep in or one of the children called out in sleep. They didn't speak of healing. They had both lived long enough to know that not all wounds closed. Some stayed with you like faded scars beneath the skin. But in each other's presence, those wounds stopped aching quite so much. Selyra never asked him to change, to explain, to reach for things he wasn't ready to hold. And Kaelen never tried to fix what had been broken in her. He simply stood beside her as it mended on its own. There was no timeline, no destination they aimed for. Only the quiet commitment of waking up and choosing to stay. Of doing the small, mundane things that made life feel less like survival and more like something worth holding on to. One afternoon, while Coren and Nira played in the snowdrifts outside, Selyra reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over Kaelen's. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense. There were no fireworks, no soft music. Just the warmth of skin against skin and the soft echo of shared time. He didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. Her touch wasn't asking for anything. It was simply there. And he let it be. They had stopped asking what they were to each other. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was that every morning when Kaelen opened his eyes, she was still there. Pouring tea. Humming to herself. Laughing with the children. Existing not as a guest in his life, but as someone who had built part of it with him. They weren't bound by duty, by tradition, or by name. They were bound by the quiet, deliberate choice of staying. And sometimes that kind of love, wordless, weightless, quietly persistent, is the kind that lasts longest of all. Altherra had never been gentle. It was a place of sharp winds and brittle silence, of frostbitten mornings and endless white. But seasons, like people, could change. It started with a patch of earth behind the cabin. Soil that had once been locked in permafrost began to yield. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it softened. Kaelen turned it over by hand, his fingers stiff from cold, but steady. Selyra brought out seeds she had kept tucked in a tin, forgotten relics from another life. Together, they planted with no guarantees, only quiet hope. Weeks passed. Then one morning, just before the sun crested the ridgeline, a green shoot broke the surface. Delicate, insistent. It trembled in the breeze, alive despite everything. By mid-season, the garden was more than a garden, it was a quiet miracle. Small berries clung to thin branches. Leaves rustled in a hush only the attentive could hear. Nira named each plant as if they were pets. Coren kept a notebook filled with drawings and careful notes. This one bends toward the light, he once whispered. Like us. Inside the cabin, change had settled in with equal gentleness. What was once a space of bare essentials now felt lived in, almost warm. Shelves lined with books and hand-labeled jars. A soft chair by the window where Selyra sometimes read with Nira curled beside her. A sturdy table marked with scratches and crayon doodles. A corkboard hung near the door, part map, part art display, part chaotic family calendar drawn in mismatched ink. Kaelen built a proper pantry, then a storage shed, then a second room where Coren could work on his sketches undisturbed. Tools were hung with care. Firewood was always stacked high, not just for survival, but for comfort. The home no longer looked temporary. It had weight, memory, intention. Even the wilderness began to shift. Birds they had never seen before made nests beneath the eaves. One morning, a rabbit darted across the path, pausing just long enough for Nira to gasp and laugh, her mittened hands flung wide in delight. Footprints became more common around the clearing, not human, but signs of life nonetheless. It was as if the land had been waiting for them to stay long enough to belong. Still, nothing was perfect. The roof leaked sometimes when the snow melted too fast. The stove jammed. Arguments flared over burnt stew or forgotten chores. There were cold days when memories crept in and settled heavy over them all. But the cracks no longer threatened collapse. They had become part of the structure, visible, honest, filled in with care. Like the patched corner of Nira's coat. Like Kaelen's old boots resoled twice. Like Selyra's soft singing as she shelled dried beans, her voice worn but steady. This place, once a refuge carved from necessity, had become something else. Not an escape. Not a hiding place. A home. Altherra hadn't become kinder. But in its quiet thaw, it had offered them room to grow, not in spite of the cold, but alongside it. And in that slow blooming, in the garden, the walls, the spaces between footfalls, love had taken root. Not loud, not flawless, but real. The light poured in like a blessing, slanted gold through the western window, stretching long across the cabin floor. Dust motes drifted lazily in the warmth, catching on old wood and soft fabric. Outside, the last of the snow melted in quiet rivulets along the garden rows. Inside, laughter echoed off the walls Kaelen once thought would always be silent. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, leaning against the frame, watching them. Selyra was seated at the table, peeling root vegetables with a kind of meditative grace, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Nira, perched beside her, hummed as she folded paper into misshapen stars. Coren sat cross-legged on the bench, a pencil tucked behind one ear, halfway through a sketch of a bird they'd spotted earlier near the tree line. They didn't notice him watching, not at first. That was part of what made it real. He wasn't the center of the room. He was simply in it. A part of something. Once, this cabin had been a shelter against the elements. Then, a sanctuary for healing. Now, it was just their home. Kaelen felt something settle in his chest, deep and quiet. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was something softer. A kind of peace that asked for nothing in return. He had spent so long running from the weight of his past, his failures, his grief, the ghost of his daughter's last breath echoing across a battlefield he couldn't leave behind. But now he stood in a place he had built with his own hands, among people he had not sought, but somehow found. And he had stayed. Every day he had made the choice to stay. That choice, more than anything, was what had changed him. He was no longer just a soldier who had survived. No longer just a man marked by what he'd lost. He was Kaelen, just Kaelen. A teacher. A mender of coats. A keeper of quiet promises. A presence that could be leaned on, laughed with, lived beside. Selyra looked up as if sensing him there. Their eyes met across the room. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She just saw him. Fully. As she always did. As he had once feared no one ever would again. And in her gaze, he felt it, the fullness of this moment. Not as a reward, not as a redemption, but as something earned slowly, day by day, in the unremarkable miracle of choosing to remain. He walked forward, sat down beside Coren, and reached for a paring knife. The boy handed it to him without a word, as natural as breathing. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing earth. A bird called from the eaves. The future remained unwritten, uncertain as always. But Kaelen no longer feared it. He had found something that didn't need to be perfect to be whole. Something stitched together from broken things. Something fragile, yes, but strong in the way that only love born from pain can be. It was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a life. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If this story made you feel something even just a little, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone you love. More stories are on the way and I'll be right here, ready to tell the next one whenever you're ready to listen.